mudlarking friends, and welcome back to the Letter Purse Profiles. In this series, we travel through time and focus our lens on the fascinating lives of an old English family which came into being in the 13th century. You'll remember the Letter Purse, handed down through generations, now in the keeping of the Thorney Island Society. For a refresher on how it got there, check out the first episode in this series, link in the video description. Today we're looking at the life and descendants of the favourite niece of Lady Gerard, once the keeper of the Letter Purse. It's time to meet Leontine de la Pasteur, née Standish. Leontine seemed pretty wholesome to me, despite the inevitable colonial links, and we'll get to that in a minute, but it's when we get to her descendants that our story becomes a rip-roaring tale of intrigue, deceit, lavish living, with raucous and rambunctious revelling, and many, many marriages. There's much sadness too to this tale, right from the beginning, starting with a tragic death followed by fraught and fractured relationships and lots of money. We have our fair share of aristocratic eccentrics too, with castles here, yachts there, and islands all over the place. My research has thrown up many unanswered questions which will need further investigation. However, I think it's most appropriate to draw a line under what's publicly available and leave the rest open to interpretation, particularly in the case of family lines with living members. We will look into Leontine's descendants in future episodes as there is so much to get through. So for now, let's look at the life of Lady Gerard's cherished niece, Leontine Standish, who was to become Leontine Countess de la Pasteur. Leontine Standish, known as Lily, was Lady Gerard's favourite niece. Lily lived at Lady Gerard's home, Portobello House in Mortlake, London. Now demolished, the house once stood in South Warple Way and was owned by prominent Catholics since the late 18th century. Remember, the Georgian Letter Purse is decorated with Catholic emblems, and the Strickland Standish family, dating back to the 13th century, were all committed Catholics. Leontine, Lily, was described as a charming girl and graceful social butterfly, and a virtuous noblewoman with great strength who opened her arms to the needy. The presumed only daughter of Lord Charles Strickland Standish, Lily's mother is unknown. Her three older brothers' mother died 10 years before Lily was born. On July 4th, 1864, at the age of 20, Lily married a British-French nobleman, Gerard Gustavus de Querelle, the fourth Marquis de la Pasteur, whose relatives were forced to leave France during the French Revolution. The wedding ceremony took place at a Catholic church, of course, St Mary Magdalene in Mortlake, close to Lady Gerard's home. The family had strong ties to this church, and several family members are buried there, including the explorer Sir Richard Francis Burton and his wife, the writer, explorer and adventurer Isabel Arundel, another fascinating couple who we will again look at in a future episode. Although happy in leafy Mortlake with her aunt, Lily was now married, and the plan was never to stay put in England. The Count de la Pasteur and his brother Henry owned a large amount of land in New Zealand, in Maori, Aotearoa. And in October 1864, just 3 months married, the Count and now Countess Lily embarked on a 2-month journey across the seas to New Zealand. The Countess, ill-prepared for her new role as an adventuring colonist's wife, took it all in her stride. At this point, I will briefly address early British colonists in New Zealand. From 1840 until 1907, New Zealand was a British colony. The main settlement period of New Zealand was by Polynesians in the 14th century, who developed their Maori culture based on kinship links and bond with the land. Dutch and British explorers came along in the 17th and 18th centuries, and British explorer James Cook was the first to map the land. From the late 18th century onwards, explorers, traders, sailors and missionaries were frequent visitors to the island, and being the people that we are, saw what presented as an excellent opportunity for growth and wealth. Or is that growth of wealth? And of course, a lot of meddling. You know this story by now. The Europeans took charge. In 1840, the British reached an agreement with the Maori people in which we governed their land, and the Maoris received the same rights as British subjects. I'm not going to give you the history of this, as it's highly political, contested, and I could not do the subject justice. However, needless to say, I strongly suggest you delve into this yourselves and do some reading on the subject. I'm still learning about it. It's a massive topic to get stuck into. With the arrival of the Europeans came exposure to infectious diseases, the kind of which the Maori were totally unprotected from. New Zealand wars, the imposition of an alien monetary economy and legal system led to most of the Maori land passing to European ownership, and in that way the story often goes, the Maori became impoverished. It goes without saying that the European settlers did make many positive contributions to Maori life, but inevitably, colonisation led to great upheaval and some tragic consequences. As I said, I'm still learning about this subject, so as ever, if you have any corrections or comments, additional information you'd like to add, please leave me a comment. So, back to the Count and Countess de la Pasteur. With just one servant in tow, the Count and Countess settled into their first-class cabin on board the SS London, setting sail for Melbourne, Australia, via Cape Town, South Africa. It doesn't sound too hard a life really, does it? Even if you're roughing it with only one servant. But we haven't got to the rough and tumble yet, folks. The journey across oceans was the easy part. On the 2nd of January 1865, the SS London set down in Hobson Bay, Melbourne. Countess Lily had family awaiting her. Her brother, Charles Frederick Standish, known as Frederick, lived in Melbourne. He'd left England in the 1850s, having suffered heavy losses on the GGs. Now that's horse racing to you non-Brits. It wasn't all bad though, and thanks to his brief military career in England, Frederick was appointed Chief Commissioner of Police in the Victorian Mounted Constabulary. We'll look more at Frederick in another episode, particularly at his pursuit of the Ned Kelly gang. The Count and Countess didn't stay long in Melbourne. There they said their hellos and goodbyes to Frederick, then boarded the SS Hero, setting sail for Lyttelton, New Zealand. And this is where things became tricky. Let's take a quick look at the ground they needed to cover. They landed at Christchurch, but their destination was Nelson, a province where sheep outnumbered people 47-1. It was a treacherous journey, encountering land which, and I quote, was impossible to ride over and dangerous even to walk upon. Just after landing at Christchurch in the region of Canterbury, Lily received some sad news. Her favourite aunt, Lady Gerard, had died. She was taking the sea air at Brighton, as Victorians so loved to do when old Father Time came calling. While most of her riches were left to her brother-in-law, of course he was a man at the time things went to men, Countess Lily was to receive the residuals, i.e. everything else that's left, which included books, ornaments, watches and other articles of virtue. For example, trinkets, snuff boxes, crafted pieces, etc. These items arrived at Lily's destination of Nelson in the final months of 1865. I wonder if the letter purse was one of the items of virtue. It certainly fits the criteria. Now to the journey, one that a Count and Countess could surely have never been prepared for. By main road, from their landing point of Christchurch, Canterbury, they could make it as far as the Huranui River, where, due to lack of any bridge, travellers, in theory, could make the journey across by ferry. But this was a task in itself. You see, the ferryman's house was a good half-mile from the river, so whether any traveller waiting to cross could be seen was sheer pot luck. They would have to go in search of the ferryman. If the ferryman was not to be found, some brave travellers took their chances and pushed their luck by crossing the river on horseback. The river was rapidly flowing, and fording it was extremely dangerous. If you made the crossing in one piece, you then had the swampy gauntlet of the Culveden Run to power through in the Waiau Gorge. These days, apparently, the Culveden area is populated with energising walks, where one can stop off for a swim and even a shop. In 1865, I don't think it was quite the same. A blog I have turned to time and again to get my head around this journey is the excellent Lost Christchurch, a website dedicated to heritage in Christchurch. I'm quoting directly from their website now. Crossing the Waiau Bridge, they needed to travel over swampy ground and riverbed to the foot of Jolly's Pass. From there it went over the pass, the benchings from the top of the spur leading to Jolly's Pass until the saddle, inclining at an angle of at least 50 degrees, worn smooth by rain and traffic, impossible to ride over and dangerous even to walk upon. Down the Clarence through a succession of swamps and atrociously bad side cuttings to the junction with the Acheron. You get the idea, it was tough, and that was was only the first leg. Following this leg, there was a guest house that one could stop at, but again, another river got in the way. And the chances were, if you were arriving in winter, you'd turn up with your baggage utterly soaked to the bone with no one to greet you, as the guest house was often totally empty in that period. This was at least on the Nelson side though. They were on the right track, right? Or maybe not, as there were many more rivers to go, including the Alma, whose landing place being so narrow and steep, and the river so rapid that, in case of a momentary failure of the horse to maintain its hold on the landing place, horse and rider must be swept into the Severn. Nice. From the Alma, a narrow valley was to be negotiated. This did not come without issues either. One false step could bury a horse in a swamp, from which would be impossible to recover him from. The journey continued much in this way, with twists and turns around every corner. And of course, we know that the Count and Countess did get to their final destination in one piece, or we would have no future tale to tell. So, not easy going after all. The Count and Countess navigated the route admirably. Along the way to their final destination, Lily and the Count were stopping off at the sheep stations that he and his brother Henry had invested in. In the Waiau Gorge, Gerard and Henry had bought the 63,000-acre Glenwye station, as well as the St James and St Helens, comprising 8,535 acres freehold, 28,938 leasehold, with 18,000 sheep and sundry cattle and horses. To say that the accommodation at the isolated stations were not fitting for a lady of the period to be staying in, let alone travelling overland to, was an understatement. And this is why I love Leontine, or Lily as she was known. She was even once thrown out of a buggy at one point near Culverden and ended up in a nearby creek. The creek is known as Countess Creek to this very day. Writing of a similar incident on the Riccarton Road near Christchurch, she refers to the Countess Creek incident. Leontine said, "Mr. Wrigley affected the capsize of his large American wagon the other day on the Riccarton Road, dislocated Mrs. W's elbow and sprained Miss M's ankle. Better by far that they followed our precedent and upset into the water." Courageous and adventurous she might have been, but Lily was still mindful of accidents and, in some cases, even death. Again, writing to a friend in 1868, she states, "In case of my accident by sea or land, let me here put in writing that I wish everything I die possessed of, be it money, vitals, books, pictures, articles of virtu, and also a sum of money, to belong to my husband." Life for the Count and Countess would have been very different to their family back home in England. The upstairs-downstairs division of gentlemen, women and staff did not apply here. The Count often dined with his workers, former shepherds and ploughmen from Scottish crofting communities, and the Countess's closest female friends were her domestic staff. Again, at least one of them may have been Scottish. A great number of Scottish people who were in service, domestics, farmers, ploughmen and the like, came over to New Zealand to work on the colony in the mid-19th century. But it wasn't all roughing it at isolated sheep stations with only your staff for company. Lily went to stay for some months at a Swiss boarding house, Panama House, in Nelson. She wasn't the only upper-class visitor, and during her time there she met and dined with New Zealand's British Governor, Sir George Grey. The Nelson Evening Mail, dated 9th of April 1869, described Lily's stay in Nelson in this way. During this time she contrived by her amiable disposition, her numerous charities, and her fascinating manners to endear herself to a large circle of friends and acquaintances. She certainly made her mark, and although it seems strange to say it these days, really held her own without her husband by her side. Don't forget, at that time, the late 19th century, the role of woman as leader and sole host would not have been such a common sight. She wowed important society figures and their wives, and during a presentation of prizes at a sporting awards ceremony, when she commented on each prize winner's achievements, she received 3 hearty cheers from the boys. Lily was also proficient in music and spent time entertaining society friends and Nelsonians with her piano skills. She was clearly well liked and well received. Following the fun at Nelson, the Countess was reunited with the Count and they installed themselves at Springfield, a large 15-room property that stretched from Innis to Springfield Road in Merivale. Springfield was built on high, dry land and boasted a good water supply and drainage system, outbuildings and stables, and would have been a deluxe homestead in the late 19th century. Count Gerard was elected to the Amuri Road Board at this time. Life was comfortable to say the least, and one would imagine very happy indeed. But what's life if it doesn't have something tricky for you just round the corner? Something tricky might be underplaying it slightly, for the Countess was pregnant and happily gave birth to a baby girl on the 7th of April 1869. It was a happiness coupled with sadness, as the very next day, following complications during childbirth, at the age of just 26, Lily Leontine Countess de la Pasteur lost her life. The baby girl was named Monica Lily in honour of Leontine's much-favoured aunt, Lady Gerard, and of course to mark the sad passing of a mother she would never know. Count Gerard would have been left totally bereft, with his new baby by his side. A month after burying Lily, he sold off household goods, a pair of his and her mares, a pony, and a number of other items, including livestock. It was time to gather his strength and deal with what needed to be done. It took 4 years until he found a new wife, further proving the great loss suffered by Lily's death. Monica Lily was to have a stepmother, Georgina Lochnan, daughter of an Ireland-born former judge, now in the service of the East India Company. The Count and Georgina, the second Countess, along with Monica Lily, eventually took up residence at the Lochnan family home, a house on Ferry Road, Christchurch, called Tilford. More tragedy was to follow. The second Countess was pregnant and gave birth to a baby named Mary. However, Mary died the same day she was born. This marked the end of the Count, second Countess, and Monica Lily's time in New Zealand. They decided to move back to England and settled in Yorkshire at Cayley Hall. Another pregnancy followed. This time a boy named Charles was born. Count Gerard and Countess Georgina would go on to have 4 happy children of their own, half-siblings to Monica de la Pasteur, and live out the rest of their lives in comfort. Monica Lily, the young lady who tragically never met her mother, is who will be carrying the baton in the next episode of the Letter Purse Profiles. Monica Lily de la Pasteur, a glamorous beauty who set tongues wagging in social circles, who later became a Charrington of the Charrington brewing dynasty, and finally a Bullough of the island of Rum. Monica is where the excitement comes in, a long life drenched in intrigue, decadence and desire, and that is where we shall pick up next time. Until then, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you on the foreshore very soon for another episode in my other series, Mudlarking with Old Father Thames.